It was a cold December morning in 2004, the kind that seeps into your bones like regret, when they found Gary Webb in his Sacramento home.
The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the faint echo of silence that follows a life abruptly ended.
Webb, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, whose words once cut through the fog of official narratives like a switchblade in a back alley, lay there with not one, but 2 gunshot wounds to the head. A detail that lingers in the mind, defying the neat conclusions drawn by those in power. The Sacramento County coroner, Robert Lyons, ruled it a suicide, his report crisp and clinical amid the chaos of scattered papers and unpacked boxes from Webb's recent move. Yet in the dim light of that suburban bedroom, the scene whispered of something more tangled, more insistent on scrutiny. 2 shots to the head. Most folks figure 1 does the job. But here was Webb, his body sprawled as if the first hadn't quite sealed the deal, raising questions that echo through the corridors of doubt, challenging us to wonder if despair alone could orchestrate such redundancy. This wasn't just any reporter. Gary Webb had built his reputation at the San Jose Mercury News, where the newsroom buzzed with the clatter of typewriters and the acrid smoke of deadline cigarettes. A place where stories were chased with the fervor of a detective on a hot lead. Back in 1996, he unleashed the Dark Alliance series, exposing the shadowy ties between CIA-backed Contras, crack cocaine flooding American streets, and the complicit blindness of institutional power. The era was one of lingering Cold War paranoia, where government secrets festered like untreated wounds in the national psyche. Webb's reporting peeled back layers of denial, revealing how U.S. support for Nicaraguan rebels intertwined with drug trafficking that ravaged inner cities. Yet this truth, sharp and unyielding, invited a backlash that dismantled his career piece by piece, leaving him isolated in a wilderness of professional exile. The major outlets circled like vultures, discrediting his work with editorials that reeked of establishment loyalty, while Webb watched his Pulitzer glory fade into whispers and skepticism. It was a time when questioning authority meant risking everything, and he paid with his standing in the journalistic brotherhood. Years later, official inquiries would quietly affirm key elements of his Dark Alliance claims, vindicating the man long after the damage was done. But by then, the narrative had shifted, leaving us to ponder the cost of truth in a world where institutional power guards its secrets with ruthless efficiency. Webb's death on December 10, 2004, came amid personal turmoil, divorce, financial strain, the weight of a silenced voice. But those 2 wounds gnawed the edges of the suicide verdict, suggesting a puzzle where the pieces refused to interlock without forcing the hand of coincidence. In the quiet suburbs, far from the gritty underbelly he once exposed, his passing evoked the ghosts of accountability journalism, where probing too deep into the machinations of power can lead to isolation, or worse, a finality that begs for re-evaluation. Forensic details painted a picture of self-inflicted despair, yet the redundancy of those shots disrupts the symmetry of an easy explanation, compelling us to question if institutional shadows extended beyond his career, touching the very end of his story. Webb had enemies, or at least those who preferred his silence. The 1980s and 90s were riddled with covert operations that blurred lines between ally and adversary. And his work shone a light into corners where complicity thrived, under the guise of national security. The paradox stands stark. A man who unearthed the drug-fueled undercurrents of U.S. foreign policy only to be buried under waves of denial and disbelief. His legacy a testament to the perils of challenging the pillars of institutional power. As we delve into this enigma, the air thickens with unresolved tension, each fact a thread in a tapestry of doubt. Webb's story isn't just about one journalist's fall. It's a mirror reflecting the broader struggles of truth against the machinery of control. His Dark Alliance series, born in the fluorescent hum of the Mercury news offices, connected dots from Central American jungles to Los Angeles ghettos, implicating forces that prefer to operate in the dark, their influence rippling through decades of policy and pain. Professional isolation followed, a slow suffocation where allies turned away and opportunities evaporated like morning mist. This downfall underscores how institutional power can orchestrate a narrative's demise, leaving the truth-teller adrift in a sea of contrived controversy. The official suicide ruling, delivered with the coroner's detached precision, clashes against the backdrop of Webb's resilient spirit, a man who fought back against discredit with books and persistence, making his abrupt end a riddle wrapped in forensic ambiguity. 2 gunshot wounds. That repetition haunts the case, a forensic echo that defies the simplicity of despair alone, urging us to consider if external pressures amplified his inner demons to a fatal crescendo. In the end, Gary Webb's death and legacy form a noir portrait of journalism's dark side, where exposing the entanglements of power and vice can lead to personal ruin. And the questions left unanswered pulse like a heartbeat in the night. As we step back into the shadows of history, the intrigue builds. What forces shaped the world that Webb dared to illuminate? And how did they conspire to dim his light forever? To understand the storm that Gary Webb unleashed with his Dark Alliance series, we have to wind the clock back to the shadowy underbelly of the 1980s. A decade soaked in the chill of the Cold War and the heat of covert operations. The Reagan administration was deeply entangled in backing the Contras in Nicaragua, those rebel fighters waging a guerrilla war against the leftist Sandinista government. It was a proxy battle in the grand chess game against Soviet influence, with US dollars and arms flowing south under the guise of anti-communist fervor. Picture the White House briefings then, rooms thick with cigarette smoke and the murmur of urgent whispers, where policymakers plotted to support these insurgents, even as public sentiment wavered. The air carried the metallic tang of typewriters clacking out classified memos. And the implication was clear. This support wasn't just about ideology, but about maintaining American dominance in a world teetering on the edge of superpower collapse. Yet Congress, sensing the moral quicksand, passed the Boland Amendments. A series of legislative shackles that restricted direct funding to the Contras, starting in 1982 and tightening over the years. These weren't mere suggestions, but hard barriers meant to rein in executive overreach. In the dimly lit halls of Capitol Hill, where the echo of footsteps on marble floors mingled with the rustle of confidential documents, these amendments created an atmosphere of forced restraint, a bureaucratic fog that shrouded U.S. involvement in Central American conflicts and bred a desperate hunger for alternative funding streams. The deeper meaning here simmered beneath the surface. This opacity wasn't accidental, but a deliberate veil, implying that when official channels dried up, shadowy networks would emerge to keep the Contras armed and operational. no matter the cost to ethics or legality. Fast forward to the 90s, and the media landscape had its own brand of fortified walls. Mainstream outlets like the major newspapers held sway with an authority built on decades of institutional trust. Their front pages dictating the national narrative with the weight of ink-stained credibility. Newsrooms buzzed with the clatter of telephones and the sharp scent of fresh newsprint, an era where journalists chased stories amid the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of printing presses. This environment fostered a reliance on official sources, where challenging the status quo meant risking one's standing in the fraternity of respected reporting. The implications stretched far and wide.
Such trust in institutional narratives meant that when a lone voice like Webb's pierced through, it wasn't just questioned, but assaulted.
Revealing how the media's gatekeeping could suppress inconvenient truths in favor of preserving the established order. Enter Gary Webb, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at the San Jose Mercury News, a paper with solid reach in California's tech-savvy heartland, known for its accountability reporting that held power to account without flinching. In the bustling offices overlooking Silicon Valley's sprawl, where the air hummed with the energy of innovation and the faint ozone smell from early computers, Webb specialized in peeling back layers of government secrecy, his investigations carrying the scent of old files and late-night coffee runs. This positioned him uniquely, implying that his work on Dark Alliance wasn't born in isolation, but from a career dedicated to exposing the rot beneath polished facades, making his revelations all the more potent against the backdrop of a media world that preferred its stories neatly packaged. The Contras' plight, fueled by Reagan's backing yet starved by the Boland Amendments, set the stage for desperate alliances. Whispers of drug money filtering in from shadowy corners became the unspoken workaround, a geopolitical sleight of hand. Amid the humid jungles of Nicaragua and the sterile corridors of Washington, where the tropical rain mixed with the acrid smoke of hidden airstrips, this context painted a picture of moral ambiguity. Where ends justified means in the fog of covert wars. And here's the fracture that splits the facade wide open. These funding pressures didn't just invite corruption. They demanded it, implying a web of complicity that reached from rebel camps to American streets. Unspooling threads that Webb would later tug with relentless precision. The San Jose Mercury News, pre-Dark Alliance, commanded respect with its investigative chops, a beacon for accountability in an age when smaller papers could still punch above their weight. Desks cluttered with notepads and the low drone of fax machines defined the scene, an atmosphere charged with the pursuit of truth amid the growing digital dawn. It was here that Webb honed his craft, turning the ordinary into exposés that rattled cages.
The implication lingered like a shadow. This platform, though not as colossal as the national giants, amplified Webb's voice enough to challenge the media monoliths.
Foreshadowing the backlash when his series dared to connect the dots from Central America to urban crack epidemics. In the grand tapestry of the era, the Reagan administration's Contra support clashed against congressional restrictions, birthing a covert funding beast that thrived in darkness. The 1980s air was thick with the scent of intrigue, from Oval Office strategy sessions to Nicaraguan battlefields echoing with gunfire and the distant thrum of CIA planes. This bred an opacity that cloaked U.S. actions in layers of deniability. Deeper still, it suggested that official narratives were fragile constructs, ready to crumble under scrutiny. setting the perfect storm for a journalist like Webb to expose the hypocrisies woven into American foreign policy. As the 1990s dawned, mainstream media's trust in institutional stories shaped how Webb's work would be received, often with skepticism bordering on hostility from the establishment press. Conference rooms filled with the aroma of boardroom lunches and the shuffle of broadsheets created an environment where challenging the consensus meant isolation. It was a time when authority flowed from the top down, unquestioned by many. The implication cut to the bone. This media ecosystem wasn't just reporting the news, it was guarding the gates, ensuring that investigations like Webb's faced an uphill battle against the tide of accepted wisdom. It was the thick of July 1995, when the California sun beat down on San Jose like a relentless interrogator, and Gary Webb, that tenacious reporter from the Mercury News, found himself drawn into a web of shadows that would redefine his career. Webb had built his reputation on a foundation of unyielding persistence, the kind that thrives in dimly lit archives, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of aging paper and forgotten secrets. He was no stranger to digging deep, always chasing the truth through mazes of documents and reluctant witnesses. That summer, it all started with a pending drug prosecution, a case that whispered hints of something far larger, pulling him into months of painstaking work where every court record and interview clip became a thread in a much darker tapestry. Gary Webb began researching leads tied to this pending drug prosecution in July 1995, sifting through legal filings that crackled under his fingers like dry leaves in the wind. Amid the hum of fluorescent lights in courthouse basements that echoed with the ghosts of untold stories. This wasn't just idle curiosity. It was the spark that ignited a fire, revealing connections that stretched from the battlefields of Central America to the crumbling streets of urban America, forcing us to question how deeply the rot had spread. He spent months assembling court records, interviews, and audio recordings, piecing them together in his cluttered office where the coffee grew cold and the clock ticked indifferently through endless nights. Surrounded by stacks of transcripts that smelled faintly of ink and desperation. In that era of post-Cold War unease, with the world still shaking off the Iron Curtain's dust, Webb's methodical approach stood as a bulwark against the chaos, reminding us that truth isn't found in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet accumulation of facts. The deeper meaning here is clear. His work exposed the fragility of official narratives, showing how a single dedicated journalist could unravel threads that powerful forces preferred to keep knotted and hidden. Webb named specific foreign traffickers, such as Oscar Danilo Blandon and Juan Norwin Meneses, pulling their identities from the shadows of sealed documents and whispered confessions. In a time when the airwaves buzzed with tales of drug wars and the streets echoed with the crackle of gunfire in forgotten neighborhoods. These weren't faceless villains. They were Contra-linked traffickers with timelines etched in primary documentation. Their stories unfolding against the backdrop of Nicaragua's turmoil and the Reagan-era fervor that blurred lines between ally and enemy. By emphasizing these named individuals, Webb constructed a chain of evidence that linked them directly to U.S. crack cocaine markets, a revelation that chipped away at the facade of ignorance, suggesting protections that no democracy should tolerate. His reputation for document-rich, source-driven accountability journalism shone through as he waded through reams of affidavits and wiretap transcripts in rooms thick with the musty odor of bureaucracy, during an age when the internet was just beginning to weave its own tangled web. This methodology wasn't flashy. It was the grind of verification, set against the vibrant chaos of mid-90s California, where tech booms clashed with inner-city despair, highlighting the stark divides that Webb's reporting sought to bridge. Ultimately, it implied a systemic failure, where the pursuit of geopolitical goals overshadowed the devastation wrought on American soil, turning oversight into complicity. Webb did not assert that the CIA invented crack, but argued instead for their knowledge and protection of these operations, drawing from audio snippets that captured voices laced with evasion and half-truths in the sweltering heat of investigative stakeouts and late-night phone calls. In the context of a nation grappling with its drug epidemic, amid billowing smoke from crack pipes in alleyways and the distant thunder of congressional hearings, his claims painted a picture of deliberate blindness at the highest levels. The implication cuts deep. If protections were extended to Contra-linked suppliers, then the flood of cocaine into vulnerable communities wasn't just tragedy, but a calculated byproduct of shadowy alliances. As Webb pieced together this chain of evidence, connecting dots from Blandon's dealings to Meneses' networks, the tension mounted in the quiet rustle of turning pages, where each revelation felt like a step closer to an abyss of institutional betrayal. It is this unbroken link from foreign battlegrounds to domestic ruins that pierces the veil of deniability, leaving no room for the comfortable lies that had long shielded the powerful. Month after month, his investigation built like a storm gathering over the Pacific, with court records stacking up like evidence in a trial no one wanted to convene, in an atmosphere charged with the electricity of impending scandal. The era's cynicism, fed by Watergate echoes and fresh from the fall of the Berlin Wall, provided fertile ground for such probes, where every document unearthed carried the weight of potential upheaval. What it all meant was a challenge to the very notion of accountability, proving that journalism, when wielded with precision, could force the mighty to confront their own reflections in the mirror of truth. By focusing on these Contra-linked traffickers and their ties to U.S. markets, Webb's work illuminated the human cost, from the ravaged lives in south-central Los Angeles to the political machinations in Washington, all under the relentless glare of a summer that refused to end. In this narrative of shadows and light, his methodology stood as a testament to the power of persistence, set against a world where alliances shifted like sand. And the implications resonated far beyond the pages of a local paper. As the months wore on, Webb knew he was onto something monumental, a story that would soon break wide open, shaking foundations and drawing the eyes of the nation to the dark alliances he had so meticulously uncovered. It was the dog days of August 1996 when the San Jose Mercury News dropped the first bomb in what would become a full-scale media war. On the 18th, they published Part 1 of Dark Alliance, Gary Webb's explosive series that laid bare the shadowy connections between Central American cocaine traffickers and the crack epidemic ravaging Los Angeles. The air in newsrooms across the country hung heavy with the scent of fresh ink and brewing controversy. as Webb detailed how Contra-connected suppliers from Nicaragua funneled bulk cocaine shipments into the United States, feeding directly into the hands of dealers like Freeway Ricky Ross, the kingpin who turned South Central LA into a crack cocaine empire. This wasn't just another drug story buried in the back pages. It was a narrative that pierced the veil of the 1980s, an era when Reagan's anti-communist crusade in Central America cast long shadows over American streets, where the war on drugs clashed violently with covert operations, leaving communities shattered and questions unanswered. The implications ran deep, suggesting that the very forces fighting for freedom abroad were unwittingly, or perhaps deliberately, fueling the destruction at home. A revelation that challenged the sanctity of official denials and forced a reckoning with the human cost of geopolitical games. Then came August 19th, with Part 2 hitting the stands, expanding on the trafficking chains that linked named foreign suppliers, men like Danilo Blandón and Norwin Meneses, to the Contra cause, tracing how their cocaine operations generated funds that looped back to support the rebels, all while flooding U.S. markets with poison. Picture the bustling streets of Managua in the mid-'80s, thick with the humidity of revolution and the diesel fuels of covert transport, where these traffickers operated under the radar. Their deals brokered in dimly lit cantinas, amid the chaos of civil war, blending the lines between insurgency and narcotics. What Webb uncovered here wasn't mere coincidence. It was a systemic link that exposed how U.S. foreign policy had created blind spots, allowing drug money to flow unchecked and implicating intelligence agencies in a web of complicity that eroded public trust in institutions meant to protect. By August 20th, Part 3 sealed the trilogy, delving into the money flows that tied Contra supporters to these operations, with evidence of shipments that directly supplied Ross's network, turning kilos into crack and crack into cash that circled back to the battlefields. The era's soundtrack of hip-hop beats and police sirens in LA provided a grim backdrop, where young lives were consumed by addiction in neighborhoods already strained by poverty and neglect. The crack wave crashing like a tidal force that no one saw coming, or perhaps chose not to see. This chain of evidence didn't just connect dots. It revealed a fracture in the foundation of American justice, where the pursuit of one enemy abroad empowered another at home,
prompting whispers of conspiracy that would echo through halls of power and streets alike.
But Webb and the Mercury News didn't stop at print. They pioneered something revolutionary, posting an extensive online package of primary documents, audio clips, and transcripts right alongside the articles. A digital repository that transformed the story into an interactive archive accessible to anyone with a modem. In those early days of the internet, when dial-up tones pierced the quiet of home offices and screens flickered with nascent web design, this move democratized investigative journalism, inviting readers to sift through court records and interviews themselves, amid the hum of cooling fans and the click of mice. The deeper meaning here was a shift in power, empowering the public to verify claims and engage directly, which amplified the series' reach far beyond the Mercury News' typical audience, igniting debates in chat rooms and living rooms across the nation. Traffic to the site exploded, drawing millions of hits in a time when the web was still finding its footing, and the community impact was palpable, especially in Los Angeles, where outrage simmered in community centers and barbershops, voices rising against a system that seemed to have betrayed its own people. The streets of South Central buzzed with heated discussions under the relentless California sun. The scent of barbecue mixing with the tension of unearthed truths, as residents connected their lived experiences of the crack era to these revelations of international intrigue. This digital amplification didn't just spread information, it fostered a nationwide reverberation, challenging the narrative control of mainstream media and sparking a grassroots demand for accountability that no official statement could easily dismiss. Yet amid the rush of clicks and shares, one element stood out as the linchpin that defied easy explanations: the documented ties between Blandon, a DEAA informant, and his Contra connections. A contradiction that hollowed out the credibility of agency oversight like acid through steel. Nationwide, the series exploded beyond print, with radio shows crackling to life and phone lines lighting up as the story's innovative presentation turned passive readers into active investigators, their late-night sessions fueled by coffee and indignation. The implication was profound, signaling the dawn of a new era where transparency could outpace censorship, and communities long marginales found a platform to voice their pain and demand justice from the shadows of history. As the dust settled on those 3 fateful days, Dark Alliance had not just reported the news, it had rewritten the rules of engagement, setting the stage for the backlash and scrutiny that would follow in the weeks ahead. The ink was barely dry on Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series when the digital waves started crashing, pulling in eyes from every shadowed corner of the internet back in that sweltering August of 1996. The Mercury News had gambled on an online package, complete with documents and hyperlinks that lit up screens like neon signs in a foggy alley, and it paid off in ways no one could have predicted. Traffic surged to extraordinary levels for the time, with thousands upon thousands logging on, sharing links over dial-up connections that hummed and stuttered through the night. In an era when the web was still a novelty, a clunky beast of slow-loading pages and pixelated images, this series didn't just inform, it ignited, spreading like whispers in a crowded speakeasy, revealing how the CIA's alleged ties to Contra drug runners had flooded Los Angeles with crack cocaine. And the implication was clear. What started as a journalistic spark had become a bonfire, forcing a reckoning with truths long buried under layers of official denial and community suffering. Nowhere did the flames burn hotter than in the communities of Los Angeles, where the air hung heavy with the residue of crack epidemics that had torn through neighborhoods like South Central, leaving behind shattered families and streets echoing with the ghosts of lost lives. Grassroots outrage erupted almost immediately after the publication, with residents who had lived through the nightmare of addiction, violence, and incarceration finally seeing a narrative that connected their pain to shadowy dealings in distant jungles and Washington backrooms. Meetings sprang up in community centers, smelling of old linoleum and fervent hope, where voices rose in anger and solidarity, demanding answers for the plague that had disproportionately ravaged Black and Latino areas during the Reagan years, when crack vials littered sidewalks like discarded promises. This uproar wasn't just noise. It was a profound shift, implying that the voiceless were finding their megaphone, challenging a system that had dismissed their struggles as mere collateral damage in the war on drugs. The political ripples spread fast, drawing immediate interest from congressional figures who sensed the groundswell of public fury. It was as if Webb's words had cracked open a vault, releasing pressures that had built up over a decade of silence and suspicion. Rep. Maxine Waters emerged as a vocal advocate, her voice cutting through the humid air of Capitol Hill hearings like a switchblade, pushing for scrutiny into the CIA's role and the devastating impact on her constituents in Los Angeles, where the crack crisis had fueled mass incarcerations and deepened racial divides. In those tense autumn days of 1996, with leaves turning and tempers flaring, Waters rallied support, organizing town halls that buzzed with the energy of the aggrieved, turning personal tragedies into calls for federal accountability. Her involvement underscored a deeper truth.
When the powerful ignore the streets find ways to storm the gates,
forcing politicians to confront implications that could unravel carefully woven narratives of national security. But the real shock came from the top, when CIA Director John Dutch made a rare public response, stepping into the fray with a request for an internal investigation by the agency's Inspector General. An unprecedented move that echoed through the marble corridors of Langley like a reluctant confession. Picture the scene, not in some dim-lit office, but in the open, under the scrutiny of cameras and crowds. Deutsch, amid the crisp fall winds of Washington, acknowledged the uproar, directing inquiries that would probe the agency's connections to the Contras and their drug-financed operations. This wasn't business as usual in an era when intelligence chiefs preferred shadows to spotlights, and the air was thick with the scent of institutional unease. As public pressure mounted swiftly after the series hit, compelling even the most reticent to act. Yet here's the rub that keeps the whole affair from settling neatly into history. Deutsch's gestures, while groundbreaking, highlighted a chasm between the clamor of outraged communities and the measured, often opaque responses from institutions built on secrecy, implying that true accountability might forever dangle just out of reach. It's the sort of guarded admission that exposes the fragility of trust between the people and their guardians, a hesitation that whispers of deeper concealments yet to be unearthed. The tension simmered, a potent mix of hope and cynicism, as Los Angeles communities pressed on, their voices amplified by the extraordinary online traffic that had democratized information in ways the old guard never anticipated. Political and congressional interest peaked, with figures like Waters leading the charge, while Deutsch's involvement marked a fleeting moment of official vulnerability. In the end, these first waves of uproar revealed not just the power of Webb's revelations, but the enduring divide between those who suffer in silence and the institutions that claim to protect them. A divide that would only widen as the backlash began to build. The embers of outrage from Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series were still glowing hot in the fall of 1996, stirring up communities and shaking institutional foundations. When the counterattack began, not from shadowy government operatives, but from the very pillars of mainstream journalism. It started in October, with the Washington Post firing the first salvo. Their investigative piece dissected Webb's work with surgical precision, pointing out how he had overstated claims about the CIA's direct involvement in the crack epidemic that ravaged America's inner cities. Picture the scene in those marble halls of the Post, where the air hung heavy with the scent of fresh ink and old rivalries. as reporters pored over documents under fluorescent lights that cast long shadows across their desks. This was the era when the internet was just beginning to whisper, but print still held the throne. And the Post's critique landed like a thunderclap in a storm that had been brewing since Webb's series dropped. The implication was clear. By framing his story with dramatic flair, Webb had crossed into editorial overreach, blurring the lines between solid evidence and sensational narrative, which in turn eroded the credibility of his entire exposé and invited skepticism from those who valued measured reporting over fireworks. Not to be outdone, the Los Angeles Times joined the fray that same month, publishing a multi-part investigation that zeroed in on the ambiguous causal links in Webb's reporting. They argued that while there might have been tangles between Contra funders, drug traffickers, and low-level CIA assets, the evidence fell far short of proving any orchestrated plot from the agency's top brass. In the sprawling newsroom of the Times, amid the haze of cigarette smoke that lingered despite no smoking signs, and the relentless clack of keyboards echoing like gunfire in a canyon, journalists sifted through the same murky waters of the 1980s Contra War, a time when Reagan's America grappled with the ghosts of Vietnam and the chill of the Cold War's endgame. This dissection meant that Webb's bold connections, once seen as revelatory, now appeared as fragile threads, easily snapped by the weight of institutional scrutiny, ultimately casting doubt on whether the CIA had knowingly fueled the crack crisis or merely turned a blind eye to peripheral sins. Then came the New York Times, piling on with its own critical coverage later in 1996 and into May of 1997. Echoing the sentiments of its peers by highlighting the insufficient proof of CIA orchestration at the highest levels, their pieces methodically unpacked Webb's wording, showing how phrases like the CIA's army implied a direct command structure that the facts simply didn't support. The Grey Lady's offices buzzed with the low hum of deadline pressures and the faint aroma of coffee brewed strong enough to wake the dead. In an age when the World Wide Web was weaving its first threads, but newspapers still dictated the national conversation, their critiques forming a chorus that drowned out the initial roar of Webb's revelations. Beneath it all lay the deeper truth. These attacks weren't just about facts, but about protecting the sanctity of journalistic standards, implying that Webb's Mercury News had ventured too far into the realm of advocacy, leaving him isolated in a field where alliances could make or break a career. This organized mainstream rebuttal, coalescing in late 1996, reshaped public perception almost overnight. What had been a rallying cry for communities scarred by the crack epidemic now morphed into a debate over journalistic integrity, with Webb painted as an overzealous crusader rather than a meticulous investigator. The streets outside the newsrooms echoed with the honk of rush-hour traffic and the distant wail of sirens, reminders of the real-world chaos Webb had sought to explain during a time when trust in media was already fraying at the edges, pulled taut by scandals and the slow creep of digital disruption. The fallout was profound, as this media onslaught applied immense pressure on the San Jose Mercury News and Webb himself, turning what might have been a triumphant exposé into a siege that forced introspection and retreat, with doors slamming shut in mainstream outlets thereafter, leaving Webb to navigate the backlash alone. It's that glaring void in the chain of command. No directive from CIA headquarters linking top officials to the drug flow that unravels the tight weave of Webb's narrative, exposing it to the relentless winds of doubt. As the critiques mounted, the atmosphere grew thick with accusation and defense. Webb's series, once a beacon in the fog of forgotten histories, now flickered under the harsh glare of his peers' spotlights. Each article chipping away at the foundation he had so carefully built. In boardrooms and bullpens across the country, the scent of printed toner mixed with the tension of ideological battles, harking back to an era when the press was both watchdog and gatekeeper, fiercely protective of its own domain. Ultimately, this pushback didn't just question facts, it redefined the story's legacy, implying that in the rush to expose hidden truths, Webb had sacrificed precision for impact. A sin that the establishment could not forgive, setting the stage for the Mercury News' own reckoning. The pressure built like storm clouds over Silicon Valley, where innovation clashed with old-school journalism. In those waning days of 1996, when the world was tilting toward a new millennium, yet haunted by the unresolved sins of the past. And so, the media's counterattack not only seized institutional credibility, but also personalized the assault on Webb, leaving him to weather the storm as his supporters dwindled and the narrative shifted from conspiracy to controversy. This phase marked a turning point, where the echoes of typewriter keys gave way to the silence of closed doors. In an America grappling with its shadows, the critique serving as a reminder, the truth in journalism is as much about what you can prove as what you believe. As the year drew to a close, the mainstream press's reaction solidified, their collective voice overwhelming the initial outcry, and applying a vice-like grip on the Mercury News that would soon force its hand. The air in San Jose carried the faint chill of approaching winter, mixed with the metallic tang of uncertainty, as Webb felt the weight of the world's gaze shift from admiration to accusation. In the end, these critiques didn't dismantle the core of Webb's findings, but they muddied the waters enough to dilute their power, implying a cautionary tale about the perils of challenging the status quo without an ironclad shield of evidence. The echo of mainstream media's condemnation still hung in the air like cigarette smoke in a dimly lit bar. But now, the scrutiny turned inward, piercing the walls of the San Jose Mercury News itself. It was a self-inflicted wound that would bleed out slowly, reshaping careers and truths alike. On May 11th, 1997, Jerry Sepos, the executive editor whose name carried the weight of institutional authority, stepped forward with a front-page editorial that acknowledged the shortcomings of Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series, a public admission laced with the sterile precision of corporate regret. In the bustling newsroom where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the clatter of keyboards formed a relentless symphony, this was no mere correction. It was a deliberate retreat amid the mounting pressure from Washington and rival outlets, the kind of atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions and the faint scent of brewing coffee gone cold. Sepos wrote plainly that while the series had illuminated disturbing connections, there was no proof that top CIA officials knew of the alleged relationships between Contra supporters and drug traffickers. This concession dropped like a lead weight into a still pond, rippled outward, undermining the very foundation of Webb's explosive claims, and signaling a broader erosion of confidence in the story's most provocative assertions. Behind the scenes, the Mercury News had already initiated an internal re-reporting effort, a meticulous dissection of their own work conducted in hushed conference rooms, where stacks of documents cast long shadows under desk lamps, reflecting the late 90s era of journalism grappling with the internet's nascent demands for accuracy and transparency. They pored over sources and timelines, verifying facts against the raw hum of fax machines and the digital glow of early web archives. Yet this process, intended as a safeguard, instead exposed vulnerabilities that fed into a narrative of overreach, implying that the paper's initial boldness had ventured too far into uncharted territory without sufficient anchors. As part of this reckoning, the Mercury News quietly altered the copy on their website, toning down the bold headlines and softening the language that had once screamed of conspiracy. In the quiet hours when the office emptied and janitors' carts echoed through the halls, these changes whispered of an institution bending under external winds. A move that diluted the series' impact and hinted at a deeper capitulation to preserve credibility. For Gary Webb, the fallout was personal and profound. Reassigned to a small bureau in Cupertino, far from the heartbeat of San Jose's editorial corps, he found himself isolated in a satellite office where the air conditioning hummed monotonously and the phone rang less frequently, a stark contrast to the adrenaline-fueled days of his investigative prime. This marginalization unfolded in the spring and summer of 1997, amid California's golden haze and the distant roar of Silicon Valley's tech boom. But for Webb, it felt like exile. The reassignment stripped him of resources and editorial support, implying a professional demotion that eroded his standing and foreshadowed the end of his tenure at the paper. The isolation deepened as colleagues who once rallied around his scoops now kept their distance, conversations turning curt in the break room, where vending machines dispensed sodas with a mechanical thud. This professional dismantling wasn't just about geography. It was a systematic unraveling of alliances, revealing how quickly institutional loyalty could shift when the stakes involved powerful adversaries. By December 1997, the strain had become unbearable. Webb resigned from the Mercury News, his departure announced in a brief statement that masked the bitterness of betrayal. Set against the backdrop of holiday lights twinkling outside, fogged windows, and the chill of a Bay Area winter settling in. In those final months, as memos flew and desks were cleared, the resignation marked not just the end of a job, but the culmination of a marginalization process that left him adrift. It underscored the fragility of journalistic independence, implying that challenging entrenched powers could exact a heavy personal toll, often leaving the truth seeker to wander in the shadows alone. Mainstream outlets, once potential allies, largely closed their doors to him thereafter, their rejections arriving in crisp envelopes or curt emails amid the clutter of his new, uncertain routine. This exclusion amplified his marginalization, painting a picture of an industry more invested in self-preservation than in pursuing uncomfortable truths. And here's the revelation that pierces through the fog of denials. The very editorial, meant to clarify, ended up casting a longer shadow over Webb's career than any external critique. A contradiction that exposes the precarious balance between journalistic integrity and institutional survival. The lack of proof that top CIA officials knew, as Ceppos emphasized, became the fulcrum on which the entire narrative tilted. In the dim light of hindsight, surrounded by the musty scent of archived newspapers, it suggested that while the connections existed, the highest echelons might have remained conveniently blind, an implication that fueled ongoing debates about accountability and complicity. Webb's story, once a beacon in the night, now flickered in isolation, its architect sidelined. This chapter of professional dismantling served as a cautionary tale, Woven into the fabric of late 90s journalism where ambition clashed with caution, leaving scars that time would only partially heal. As the Mercury News distanced itself and Webb faded from its pages, the stage was set for official inquiries to take center stage. Federal investigations by the CIA and Department of Justice Inspectors General would soon delve into these shadowy allegations, producing findings as nuanced as they were contentious. But that's a thread we'll unravel next, peeling back the layers of institutional probes that promise clarity, yet often delivered more questions than answers. In the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights, where the air hung heavy with the scent of old coffee and fresh ink from government printers, the story took a turn toward the official corridors of power. We'd watched Gary Webb's world crumble under the weight of retractions and reassignments at the Mercury News, his explosive series reduced to whispers in the wind. But as the controversy swelled like a storm over the nation's capital, the federal machinery finally creaked into motion. It began with the CIA's own Inspector General, a figure shrouded in the bureaucracy's shadows, tasked with peering into the agency's darkest corners. On January 29, 1998, amidst the chill of a Washington winter that seemed to seep into every sealed document and classified file, the unclassified volume 9 of the Inspector General's report emerged into the public eye. Titled The California Story, this volume zeroed in on the West Coast allegations that had ignited Webb's firestorm, dissecting claims of CIA complicity in the crack epidemic that ravaged Los Angeles streets, where the acrid smoke of burning rubber from drive-bys mingled with the desperation of forgotten neighborhoods. The report's core finding cut through the haze like a switchblade. There was no evidence to support the claims that the CIA had conspired to traffic drugs into the United States. No grand plot orchestrated from Langley to flood inner cities with poison for profit or politics. Yet, in the stale confines of hearing rooms and amid the rustle of redacted pages, this conclusion carried the weight of an era defined by Cold War expediency, where alliances were forged in the fire of anti-communist fervor and moral lines blurred like fog on a San Francisco bay. What it meant was a partial absolution for the agency, a shield against the wildest accusations, but one that left lingering questions about accountability in a system where ends justified means, and the fallout from such choices, poisoned generations. Digging deeper, the report documented undeniable contacts between CIA assets and Contra-linked traffickers, those shadowy figures who moved in the underbelly of Central American jungles and California warehouses, their hands dirtied by cocaine bricks wrapped in plastic and desperation. These relationships unfolded against the backdrop of the 1980s Reagan era, with its pulsating synth music on the radio and the constant hum of telex machines relaying covert operations. A time when supporting the Contras against Nicaragua's Sandinistas trumped domestic drug wars. The implication here gnaws at the edges of official denial. While no overarching conspiracy was proven, these ties suggested a willful blindness, a tolerance for criminality that enabled the flow of drugs and dollars, eroding public trust like acid rain on a monument. The Inspector General highlighted concerning facts that merited attention. Instances of problematic agency conduct that whispered of oversight failures. In offices where fluorescent bulbs buzzed like trapped flies, and agents sifted through files under the veil of national security. This was the late 1990s, a period of post-Cold War reckoning, as the internet began to weave its web and public skepticism grew, fueled by scandals that peeled back the layers of government secrecy. Such admissions pointed to a deeper rot, where the pursuit of geopolitical goals allowed ethical lapses to fester, implicating not just individuals, but the institutional soul of intelligence work. In a twist that echoed through the corridors of journalism, the report offered partial corroboration of Webb's reporting, acknowledging elements of his portrayal of CIA interactions with these dubious characters, even as it rejected the broadest conspiracy claims. Picture the newsrooms then, filled with the clatter of keyboards and the sharp tang of cigarette smoke, lingering despite no smoking signs, where reporters like Webb had chased leads that now found faint echoes in official ink. This validation, however muted, underscored the peril of dismissing investigative journalism outright, revealing how truth often hides in the gray areas between outright lies and sanitized histories. But here's the revelation that unravels the neatly tied bow of exoneration. Despite the agency's insistence on clean hands, the documented lapses in oversight create a void where accountability should stand, exposing a fragility in the narrative of innocence. Volume I, focused as it was on the California saga, set the stage for broader scrutiny, its pages crackling with the tension of unfinished business in a nation grappling with its covert past. As the report landed on desks across Washington, with the faint scent of fresh print and the weight of redacted truths, it marked not an end, but a pivot in the unfolding drama. The implications stretched far, challenging the public to question how much complicity hid behind the veil of plausible deniability, in an America still healing from the scars of its own interventions. Yet, for all its revelations, this was merely the opening act. The more comprehensive, classified second volume would soon follow later in 1998, promising to probe even deeper into the agency's knowledge and conduct regarding those Contra-linked drug networks. In the quiet hum of secure vaults and amid the shuffle of classified memos, that volume waited, holding secrets that could either bury the story or resurrect it from the ashes. Having introduced the CIA Inspector General's initial report that addressed the California story, we now deepen the inquiry into the full scope of the agency's involvement by focusing on the classified Volume 2, which later was released in unclassified form. It was the spring of 1998, with the cherry blossoms in Washington fading under a persistent gray sky, as the CIA's Inspector General wrapped up Volume 2 of their exhaustive probe, a document aptly titled The Contra Story, completed on April 27th of that year. Though shrouded in classification at first, its unclassified version would emerge into the public eye by October 8th, carrying with it the weight of revelations that had simmered beneath the surface for over a decade. This report didn't just skim the edges of controversy. It delved into the tangled web of CIA relationships with Contra-linked individuals, confirming that the agency had indeed maintained connections with figures who were whispered about in the shadows of drug trafficking circles, their names echoing through forgotten corridors of power, where alliances were forged in the heat of the Cold War's final throes. Picture the dimly lit offices at Langley, the air thick with the scent of classified files and midnight oil, where operatives balanced the precarious scales of covert support for the Nicaraguan rebels against the rising tide of narcotics scandals that threatened to engulf everything. In this atmosphere, the report laid bare how these relationships persisted, even as allegations of drug involvement swirled like smoke from a hidden fire. And the implications. They pointed to a system where knowledge of these dark dealings wasn't buried in ignorance, but acknowledged in hushed tones, suggesting that the agency's awareness ran deeper than official denials had ever admitted, a partial nod to the fire Gary Webb had ignited with his series. Volume 2 documented instances where CIA personnel stepped into the fray of law enforcement actions, intervening in ways that disrupted the usual flow of justice. These weren't abstract policies, but real interventions, occurring in the gritty underbelly of investigations that spanned from Central America to the streets of Los Angeles, where federal agents clashed with shadowy directives from above. The era was one of lingering Reagan-era echoes, with the Iran-Contra affair still casting long shadows over Capitol Hill. And in this context, the report revealed how such interferences protected assets vital to the Contra cause, even as drug probes heated up like a pot left too long on the stove. What this meant was a fracture in the wall of separation between intelligence operations and domestic law, implying that the pursuit of geopolitical goals could override the war on drugs, leaving Webb's claims not entirely unfounded, but etched with the nuance of selective priorities. Perhaps most telling, the Inspector General's findings acknowledged that the CIA often prioritized its covert operations over narcotics enforcement, a choice made in the fog of war, where supporting the Contras against the Sandinistas trumped the crackdown on cocaine flows. This was no minor footnote, but a core admission, set against the backdrop of a nation grappling with its escalating crack epidemic. In the late 90s, as public scrutiny intensified and congressional hearings loomed like storm clouds, the report painted a picture of an agency navigating treacherous waters, where the hum of teletype machines and the clatter of secure phones underscored decisions that favored mission success over moral absolutes. The deeper meaning here undermined any notion of blissful unawareness, framing the CIA's actions as calculated risks that, while not constituting a grand conspiracy, certainly echoed the agency complicity Webb had alleged, albeit in a more fragmented light. Yet, for all its disclosures, Volume 2 firmly rejected the broadest allegations of an agency-wide conspiracy, stating that while pockets of knowledge and intervention existed, there was no overarching plot to flood American streets with drugs. This conclusion emerged from exhaustive reviews of cables, memos, and interviews, conducted in secure vaults where the truth was pieced together like a shattered mosaic. The atmosphere of 1998 was charged with post-Cold War reckonings, the air buzzing with debates over government accountability. And in this milieu, the report served as a bulwark against sweeping indictments, carefully delineating isolated lapses from systemic malice. Implications rippled outward, offering a relative vindication for Webb's core assertion of agency awareness, yet reinforcing the narrative that no master plan orchestrated the crack crisis, a balance that left many questions lingering in the dim light of partial truths. It's this very acknowledgement of selective interventions that casts a long shadow over the agency's denials, a revelation that erodes the foundation of their once impenetrable facade without collapsing it entirely. As we sift through these pages, the scent of redacted ink and aged paper reminds us of the era's secrecy, where Contra supporters moved like ghosts through Central American jungles and urban back alleys. Their ties to the CIA, a thread in a larger tapestry of covert aid. The report's unclassified release on October 8, 1998, came amid autumn winds, carrying whispers of reform, allowing the public a glimpse into how narcotics allegations were handled, or mishandled, in the pursuit of higher stakes. Ultimately, this volume stands as a testament to the complexities of power, where the drive to counter communism in Nicaragua overshadowed the domestic ravages of drug wars, implying that Webb's spotlight, though dimmed by controversy, illuminated cracks that official stories could no longer fully conceal. We will then contrast the CIA findings with the DOJ Inspector General's July 1998 report, which examined law enforcement handling and interference in related drug trafficking investigations. We've just peeled back the layers on the CIA's own internal reckoning. That sprawling Inspector General's review from earlier in 1998, where the agency admitted to tangled relationships with Contra-linked traffickers and a slew of questionable decisions that left more shadows than light. But the story doesn't end there. No, it spills over into the halls of justice itself, where the U.S. Department of Justice Inspector General stepped in to scrutinize how law enforcement handled, or mishandled, these explosive allegations of drug trafficking tied to the Contras. On July 23, 1998, amid the humid grip of a Washington summer where the air hung heavy with political humidity and the scent of freshly printed government reports mingled with the exhaust from idling cabs outside federal buildings, the DOJ released its findings. This wasn't some rushed memo. It was a meticulous dissection, documenting instances where law enforcement actions were affected by problematic interventions from within the very institutions sworn to uphold the law. Picture the era, not with rose-tinted glasses, but through the smog of the late 90s, when the Cold War's embers still smoldered in forgotten files, and the crack epidemic scars ran deep through American cities, leaving communities fractured and distrustful of the badges and suits that patrolled them. The report laid it out plainly. There were documented cases of interference where investigations into contra-drug connections hit inexplicable roadblocks, stalled by whispers from higher-ups, or sudden shifts in priorities that reeked of something more than bureaucratic inertia. In the dimly lit offices of federal agents, where the hum of fluorescent lights competed with the clack of typewriters fading into obsolescence, these interventions manifested as memos that redirected resources or witnesses who suddenly clammed up under pressure from above. And the implication? It chips away at the facade of unassailable integrity, suggesting that even in the pursuit of greater geopolitical aims, the scales of justice could be tipped, leaving ordinary folks, especially in the ravaged neighborhoods of south-central Los Angeles, to wonder if the system was ever truly on their side. Yet, the Inspector General didn't swallow the whole conspiracy pill. No. The report firmly rejected the broadest allegations of a sweeping institutional complicity, the kind that painted the entire government as a monolithic enabler of narco-terror. This came against a backdrop of mounting public skepticism, fueled by Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series 2 years prior, where headlines screamed of CIA complicity, and the airwaves buzzed with talk shows dissecting every detail amid the aroma of morning coffee and cigarette smoke in newsrooms across the country. By dismissing those grand claims, the report implied a more insidious truth. Not a vast conspiracy, but a series of calculated lapses that eroded trust, forcing us to question whether accountability in such halls of power is ever more than a polite fiction. Still, it corroborated partial elements of Webb's reporting, acknowledging that yes, there were problematic conducts by government actors, interventions that derailed probes into traffickers like Danilo Blandon and Norwin Meneses, figures whose Contra ties cast long shadows over the drug wars. The atmosphere of that time was thick with irony. Congressional hearings echoed through marble corridors, the sharp clicks of heels on tile floors underscoring testimonies that danced around admissions. While outside, protesters waved signs in the relentless July sun, their sweat-soaked shirts a testament to unyielding demands for truth. This added nuance to our understanding of official handling, implying that while no overarching plot existed, the selective blindness and interventions revealed a system where foreign policy trumped domestic enforcement, leaving cracks in the foundation of institutional accountability that persists to this day. Here's the rub, the detail that twists the knife in the narrative of clean hands. Those documented instances of interference don't just suggest oversight. They expose a deliberate pattern that hollows out the core promise of impartial justice. The report detailed how certain cases were shelved or diluted, with agents feeling the invisible hand of higher authorities steering them away from sensitive leads. All under the guise of national security, in an era when the Berlin Wall's fall still echoed, but the drug crisis at home raged unchecked. Implications run deep, like roots burrowing into fertile soil of doubt. It forces a reckoning with enforcement integrity, showing how the pursuit of anti-communist victories in Nicaragua could justify turning a blind eye to cocaine flooding American streets, perpetuating cycles of addiction and violence. In wrapping this up, the DOJ's findings paint a picture not of outright villainy, but of a grayscale morality, where good intentions pave roads to hellish outcomes, complicating our grasp on who guards the guardians. It's a chapter that leaves you pondering the fragile line between protection and obstruction, especially when the stakes involve empires and epidemics. And as we turn the page from these federal probes, we delve into the human elements, the key figures like Gary Webb and Jerry Ceppos, unpacking their drives, their choices, and the personal tolls exacted before, during, and after this storm of controversy. After analyzing the federal investigations that confirmed a tangled web of agency and law enforcement involvement, we turn our gaze to the human heart of this storm. The central figures ensnared in the crossfire of media scrutiny and institutional machinery. Gary Webb and Jerry Ceppos. Gary Webb was no wide-eyed novice chasing shadows in the dark. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, the kind whose byline carried the weight of unyielding truth, built on a foundation of rigorous, document-driven reporting that left no stone unturned and no claim unverified. In the dim glow of newsroom lamps during the mid-1990s, as Silicon Valley buzzed with the promise of a digital dawn, Webb hunkered down with stacks of court transcripts, federal records, and insider testimonies, piecing together a narrative that reeked of betrayal and complicity, driven by a motivation to hold power accountable in an era when the crack epidemic was still scarring America's urban underbelly. His methodology was meticulous, almost obsessive, cross-referencing sources against the cold, hard evidence of seized ledgers and wiretap logs, implying not just a story of isolated corruption, but a systemic failure that allowed drug-fueled wars to fund shadowy operations, eroding the trust between the people and those sworn to protect them. Webb's Dark Alliance series wasn't born from conjecture or hearsay. It emerged from a relentless pursuit of facts, where every allegation was backed by documents that painted a picture of Contra drug networks funneling cocaine into Los Angeles, with implications that rippled through communities devastated by addiction and violence, questioning the very morality of covert foreign policy. The air in the San Jose Mercury news offices grew thick with tension as the series hit the presses in 1996. The clatter of keyboards and the murmur of urgent phone calls underscoring Webb's drive to expose how these operations had indirectly fueled a domestic crisis, suggesting that journalism's true power lies in illuminating the uncomfortable intersections of power and profit. Contrast this with Jerry Cephos, or Jerome as some knew him, the executive editor at the Mercury News, a man steering the ship through turbulent waters, whose decisions would come to define the institutional response to the backlash that followed. Cephos was the gatekeeper, presiding over a newsroom where the scent of fresh ink mingled with the anxiety of impending scrutiny from larger media giants and government watchdogs, his editorial perspective shaped by a commitment to journalistic integrity amid the chaotic media landscape of the late 90s, when the internet was just beginning to amplify controversies. On May 11th, 1997, Cephos published an editorial that acknowledged shortcomings in the Dark Alliance series, stating there was no proof that top CIA officials knew of the drug-Contra relationship, a move that, in the quiet aftermath of heated debates, implied a retreat under pressure, prioritizing institutional survival over the raw edges of investigative zeal. The editorial was a calculated pivot, emerging from smoke-filled editorial meetings where the hum of fluorescent lights cast long shadows on weary faces. And it carried the weight of admitting that while the core facts held, the presentation may have overstated connections, suggesting that even well-intentioned journalism can buckle under the glare of establishment critique. Cephos' role extended beyond the printed word. He managed the internal fallout, overseeing Webb's reassignment to a remote bureau. A decision that echoed through the corridors of the newsroom like a muffled gunshot, implying a deeper institutional instinct to isolate dissenters when the heat from powerful adversaries becomes too intense. In the professional dismantling and isolation of Webb, who found himself sidelined in the sleepy suburbs far from the action, Cephos embodied the editor's dilemma, balancing truth-seeking with the pragmatic realities of a media ecosystem under siege, which raises questions about how institutions protect themselves at the expense of their boldest voices. This contrast between Webb's unyielding pursuit and Cephos's measured concessions paints a tale of two careers, one forged in the fires of accountability, and the other tempered by the necessities of leadership, set against a backdrop of national reckoning over intelligence overreach and media responsibility. Yet it's in Cephos's acknowledgement of those shortcomings that the true friction emerges, a concession that erodes the foundation of Webb's groundbreaking work without fully retracting it, leaving a hollow echo in the annals of journalism history. Webb's motivations, rooted in a cynicism born from years of uncovering governmental misdeeds, clashed with Cephos's editorial caution, highlighting how personal integrity can collide with corporate caution in the pursuit of truth. As the controversy swelled, the newsroom atmosphere turned from electric excitement to a palpable chill, with Cephos navigating the storm by publicly tempering the series' claims, an action that, while defending journalistic standards, effectively marginalized Webb and underscored the vulnerabilities of lone investigators against institutional tides. In reflecting on their intertwined paths, One sees Webb as the noir detective, dogged and disillusioned, his Pulitzer gleaming like a tarnished badge, while Cephos plays the pragmatic chief, making tough calls in a world where facts alone don't always shield you from the fallout. The May 11th, 1997 editorial stands as a pivotal document, its words etched in the collective memory of reporters everywhere, acknowledging flaws that implied not deceit, but overreach. Yet in doing so, it dismantled Webb's professional standing and isolated him from the fray. This tale of two careers, woven through the fabric of a scandal that refused to die, reminds us that in the shadows of power, the line between revelation and ruin is perilously thin. Next, we will examine the concrete contradictions and forensic anomalies in the aftermath of Webb's death, highlighting unresolved questions that challenge the official narrative. We've peeled back the layers on Gary Webb and his editor Joe Cephos, their motivations clashing like thunder in a smoke-filled newsroom. Now, let's step into the shadows where the real contradictions lurk. Those evidentiary quirks and forensic oddities that twist the tale of Webb's downfall and his untimely end. It starts with the CIA's own Inspector General reports, those dense tomes released in the late 90s that quietly documented agency contacts with Contra-linked drug traffickers and subtle interventions to protect them. Picture the dim-lit archives of Washington in 1998, the air thick with the scent of aging paper and bureaucratic secrecy, as inspectors sifted through classified cables from the Reagan era, uncovering ties that echoed the very lineages Webb had traced in his Dark Alliance series. Yet these confirmations didn't just validate parts of Webb's reporting, they exposed a rift in the narrative, suggesting that while the agency wasn't flooding streets with crack, their hands weren't entirely clean, leaving us to wonder how deep the institutional denial truly ran. Mainstream media, however, clung to their critiques, zeroing in on Webb's methodological weaknesses, like unsubstantiated leaps in his chain of evidence, dismissing the series as flawed journalism even after the IG reports lent credence to key elements. In the bustling newsrooms of the New York Times and the Washington Post during those tense months, typewriters clacked and phones rang with urgent calls. The atmosphere charged with a defensive fervor as editors penned takedowns that focused on Webb's sourcing gaps amid the fading neon of urban America. This stubborn refusal to reassess implied more than mere oversight. It hinted at a collective amnesia, where admitting partial truths might unravel the fragile trust between press and power, perpetuating a silence that muffled the IG's revelations. And then there's the muted coverage of those very IG reports. No major outlets issued blanket retractions or apologies, their headlines barely whispering about the confirmations that partially vindicated Webb. The airwaves and print runs of 1998 carried on with a hum of daily news, the scent of fresh ink mixing with coffee in fluorescent-lit offices, while stories of agency missteps were buried beneath election cycles and celebrity scandals. Such selective silence raises questions about allegiance, implying that the media's role as watchdog might bend under the weight of its own entanglements, leaving Webb's partial redemption lost in the echo chambers of indifference. The backlash against Webb was swift and coordinated, his career dismantled and isolated in a matter of months, despite no ironclad proof of a grand conspiracy orchestrating his fall. In the dim glow of Sacramento bars and isolated home offices around 1997, The chill of professional exile settled like fog over Webb's days, his phone lines going quiet as colleagues turned away. The era's media landscape shifting under accusations of overreach. This rapid isolation underscores a darker mechanics at play, where one man's pursuit of truth could be so thoroughly quarantined, suggesting that the system's antibodies react not to lies, but to inconvenient exposures. But the contradictions deepen when we turn to Webb's death in 2004, ruled a suicide by Sacramento coroner Robert Lyons,
who noted the unusual forensic fact of 2 gunshot wounds to the head, a rarity in self-inflicted deaths, yet deemed possible.
The coroner's office in Carmichael that December morning carried the sterile scent of formalin and regret, fluorescent lights buzzing over autopsy tables where Lyons examined the wounds, a winter chill seeping through the walls as he pondered the mechanics of despair. Here lies the forensic puzzle that defies easy closure. 2 shots from a .38 revolver challenge the simplicity of suicide, whispering of struggles or interventions that the official ruling can't fully silence. Coroner Lyons himself confirmed the suicide despite these anomalies, stating that while rare, such multiple wounds weren't impossible in determined cases. Amid the paperwork-strewn desks and echoing hallways of the Sacramento County facility, the era's forensic practices were tested against Webb's tragic end. The sound of distant traffic, a reminder of life's relentless march outside. Yet this acknowledgement of rarity invites scrutiny, implying that what seems improbable might mask deeper truths, eroding confidence in verdicts that prioritize possibility over plausibility. These intersecting contradictions form a labyrinth, where IG confirmations clash with media denials, professional ruin meets unproven plots, and forensic oddities strain against official seals. In the Noor haze of post-Cold War America, with its lingering sense of conspiracy and cover-up, these elements swirl like cigarette smoke in a dimly lit alley, each thread pulling against the others. It's this tangled web that demands we question the surface story, for in their refusal to align, they reveal a fracture in the facade, one that no amount of institutional polish can fully conceal. And it's a fracture like this, where 2 bullets pierce the narrative as surely as they did Webb's skull, that compels us to linger in the uncertainty, pondering if suicide's echo hides a more sinister report. We've sifted through the shadows of contradiction, the forensic puzzles that linger like smoke in a dimly lit room. Now, let's turn to the official narrative. The one, etched in public records and institutional ink, painting Gary Webb's downfall as a tragic cascade from professional collapse to a solitary end. It begins in the bustling newsrooms of the late 90s, where the air hummed with the clatter of keyboards and the sharp scent of fresh print. Major newspapers like the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times launched their critiques, dissecting Webb's Dark Alliance series with surgical precision. These weren't mere opinion pieces, but methodical takedowns, highlighting editorial failures and overstatements that blurred the lines between fact and inference. In the sweltering heat of journalistic scrutiny, they exposed how Webb's work, bold as it was, sometimes leaked beyond the evidence, implying a grand CIA conspiracy without the ironclad proof to back it. The implication hung heavy. In an era when the internet was just beginning to democratize information, Such lapses eroded the fragile trust between reporters and the public, turning a potential bombshell into a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked. Then came the walk back from within, on May 11th, 1997, when Jerry Seppos, executive editor of the Mercury News, penned an editorial that cut through the newsroom tension like a knife. He acknowledged a failure of process, admitting the series had overstated connections and lacked the nuance demanded by rigorous journalism.
Amid the fluorescent glow of office lights and the murmur of disillusioned staff, this public admission validated the external concerns,
pulling back the curtain on internal shortcuts that had allowed hype to overshadow verification. Deeper still, it signaled a rupture in the foundation of Webb's support, implying that even his own paper recognized the cracks, setting the stage for a career that would soon crumble under the weight of lost credibility. The official stamp came from higher up, with the Department of Justice Inspector General and the CIA's own Inspector General releasing findings that rejected the broad conspiracy claims. In the sterile corridors of government offices, amid stacks of redacted files and the faint echo of typewriters, these reports documented a lack of evidence for Webb's assertions about CIA complicity in the crack epidemic. They painted a picture of isolated missteps rather than systemic malice, underscoring how the narrative had veered into speculation, and in doing so, they implied a broader lesson about the perils of challenging entrenched powers without unassailable facts. Webb's career imploded in the aftermath, his credibility shattered like glass on a rain-slicked street. Stripped of editorial backing, he faced financial stress that gnawed at him relentlessly, compounded by a history of depression that darkened his days. In the quiet suburbs of Sacramento, where the winter chills seeped through cracked windows, Webb made preparations that spoke of a man at the end of his rope, leaving notes and tying up loose ends in a manner that screamed finality. This dissent wasn't just personal. It reflected the unforgiving machinery of the media world, where one misstep could exile a journalist to the fringes, implying that Webb's bold pursuit had cost him everything. The coroner's investigation sealed the narrative, ruling Webb's death a suicide based on scene evidence. A handgun nearby? Farewell notes scattered like forgotten confessions. All amid the disarray of a life unraveling. Coroner Robert Lyons, in the cold fluorescence of the morgue, remarked on the rarity but possibility of 2 gunshot wounds to the head in a self-inflicted act. The physical evidence aligned, with no signs of struggle in that modest home, where the air still carried the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder. Yet, it's this double echo of gunfire that lingers like an unresolved chord in a dimly lit jazz club, casting a shadow of improbability over the neatness of the verdict. Documented financial woes and prior bouts of depression wove into the story, painting a portrait of despair that led to this official ruling, grounded firmly in public records and statements from those who examined the scene. In the broader implication, it suggests a man broken not by shadows in the dark, but by the harsh light of professional fallout, where ambition met the unyielding wall of institutional truth. This is the dominant tale, the one that ties editorial critiques to institutional reviews and forensic findings, explaining Webb's downfall and death as a tragic but self-wrought end. But as we step away from this polished account, we'll venture into the alternative interpretations, the darker whispers that question motives, suppression, and those forensic oddities left dangling by the authorities. We've laid out the official line, the one that paints Gary Webb as a man broken by his own ambitions, succumbing to despair in a quiet Sacramento suburb. But now, as the fog rolls in thicker, let's chase the shadows that refuse to dissipate, the dark theories and unanswered questions that keep this case from settling into the grave. It starts with those CIA Inspector General reports, the ones that trickled out in the late 90s, confirming what Webb had alleged all along. The agency's tangled relationships with Contra drug runners and their interventions that turned a blind eye to the cocaine flooding American streets. In the dim glow of government archives, amid the rustle of classified pages finally seeing daylight, these reports emerged during an era when the internet was just beginning to hum with conspiracy whispers, and the air still carried the metallic tang of post-Cold War secrets being unearthed. Yet their partial vindication of Webb's reporting hinted at a deeper rot, suggesting that institutional power had long prioritized shadowy alliances over transparency, leaving journalists like him to bear the cost of truth-telling in a system rigged against the whistleblower. But here's where the vindication soured. The mainstream media, those towering bastions of the Fourth Estate, barely stirred to cover these confirmations, their silence as deafening as a midnight alley devoid of footsteps. This muted response unfolded in newsrooms thick with the scent of fresh ink and egos, during a time when the dot-com boom distracted the public eye, allowing the backlash against Webb to fester unchecked, his career already in ruins. The implication cuts deep, revealing how reputational destruction serves as a subtle blade for institutional suppression, dismantling a man's professional life without the mess of legal censorship or overt threats. Webb was isolated, his byline tarnished, forced into obscurity. No courtroom battles, just a slow fade orchestrated by whispers and editorials that painted him as a reckless fabulist. Shifting to the end, the forensic puzzle of his death demands scrutiny. 2 gunshot wounds to the head, ruled a suicide by Coroner Robert Lyons, who noted the rarity but stood by his finding. Picture the coroner's office in Carmichael, California, on that chilly December morning in 2004, the air heavy with formaldehyde and quiet disbelief, as Lyons examined the body amid the clinical hum of fluorescent lights and the distant wail of sirens. Statistically, such an occurrence is an outlier, a medical anomaly that begs questions about human resilience and intent, implying, perhaps, that the official ruling glosses over possibilities too uncomfortable for institutional narratives to entertain. And it's this very rarity that ignites the skepticism, a spark that refuses to be doused, challenging the tidy conclusion of self-infliction in a way that echoes through the corridors of doubt. Friends spoke of Webb's fighting spirit, their voices laced with grief and suspicion in interviews that carried the weight of late-night phone calls and shared memories from smoke-filled bars. Online forums buzzed with amateur sleuths dissecting timelines and ballistics, fostering a digital undercurrent of doubt that mainstream outlets dismissed as paranoia. Even some investigators raised eyebrows, their reports hinting at inconsistencies in the scene, suggesting that Webb's death might represent not just personal tragedy, but a broader puzzle of how power silences its critics. The timing, too, adds layers. Webb, perishing just as his vindication simmered beneath the surface, in an age when whistleblowers were beginning to find new platforms. Yet his story ended abruptly, leaving a void. This convergence implies a chilling efficiency in how institutional forces can erode a legacy, turning a journalist's pursuit of truth into a cautionary tale of isolation and unresolved mystery. Broader still, Webb's saga illuminates reputational destruction as the weapon of choice for those in power, a method that dismantles without fingerprints, leaving professionals like him isolated in the ruins of their careers. In the gritty underbelly of journalism, where the line between hero and pariah blurs, this tactic ensures compliance, suppressing stories that threaten the status quo without the need for overt violence. His death remains a forensic and institutional enigma. The two wounds a riddle wrapped in official paperwork, defying easy resolution and fueling endless speculation. As we sift through these shadows, the legacy of Gary Webb endures as a fractured mosaic, part vindicated reporter, part tragic figure, begging us to question how deep the roots of suppression run in our so-called free press. The media backlash that sealed his fate, relentless and unforgiving, underscores the fragility of truth in the face of coordinated disbelief, a force that professionally dismantled and isolated him until the end. And in this noir tableau, where cigarette smoke curls around unanswered queries, we find the unresolved puzzle. A man whose reporting pierced the veil only to be consumed by the darkness he exposed. As the shadows lengthen on this tale of intrigue and institutional shadows, we find ourselves circling back to the man at the heart of it all, Gary Webb, that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist whose pen cut through the fog of official secrecy like a blade in the night. His series, Dark Alliance, laid bare the connections between CIA-backed Contras, the crack cocaine epidemic ravaging American cities, and the government's blind eye turned to it all. In the smoky newsrooms of the mid-90s, where typewriters had given way to glowing screens, but the air still hung heavy with the scent of ink and ambition, Webb's words ignited a firestorm that scorched the corridors of power. Yet this revelation, grounded in meticulous records and whistleblower accounts, didn't elevate him to heroic status. Instead, it underscored how truth-tellers often become targets, their legacies twisted into cautionary tales about the perils of challenging the untouchable. Webb's professional dismantling was swift and surgical, orchestrated by major outlets that pounced on minor inaccuracies while ignoring the broader truths he uncovered. Amid the bustling press conferences and the relentless hum of fax machines in Washington, his isolation grew, a solitary figure watching his career unravel like a cheap suit in the rain. This wasn't mere critique. It was a blueprint for suppression, reminding us that institutional power wields reputation as its most insidious weapon, capable of muting voices before they can echo too loudly through the halls of accountability. Partial vindications came later, with government reports acknowledging the Contra drug links Webb had exposed. Yet these admissions arrived too late. Whispered in the dim light of congressional hearings long after the damage was done, the era's political theater, filled with suited figures dodging questions under harsh spotlights, only amplified the cynicism, showing how apologies from on high rarely restore what's been shattered. In the end, such half measures highlight the fragility of journalistic integrity, where even proven insights can leave a man professionally adrift, his triumphs overshadowed by the machinery of doubt. Then there's the matter of his death in 2004, officially ruled a suicide by multiple gunshot wounds, a verdict that forensic experts and skeptics alike have questioned for its improbable mechanics. in the quiet suburbs of Sacramento, where winter rains pelted the rooftops and neighbors went about their insulated lives, the scene unfolded with an eerie precision that begged for scrutiny. It's this very improbability, the logistics of self-inflicted shots, that defy easy explanation, that casts a long shadow over the official narrative, urging us to wonder if silence was enforced, not just in life, but beyond it. Webb's story, with its blend of documented exposures and lingering mysteries, probes the central question of our time. How does a society reckon with truths that threaten its foundations? His Dark Alliance series didn't just report facts. It peeled back layers of complicity in an age when urban streets crackled with the despair of addiction. And intelligence agencies operated in the murk of covert operations, their hands seemingly clean but stained by association. The implication resonates today, a stark reminder that questioning powerful institutions isn't just an act of journalism. It's a vital defense against the erosion of public trust, where unchecked authority breeds the kind of opacity that swallows lives whole. Through reputational harm, voices like Webb's are muted, their inquiries branded as conspiratorial whispers rather than the clarion calls they are. In boardrooms thick with the aroma of polished mahogany and whispered deals, this tactic ensures that investigative fires are doused before they spread. Yet in this suppression lies a deeper truth, the necessity of such scrutiny, for without it, the powerful operate in perpetual twilight, accountable only to themselves. The reverberations from Dark Alliance continue, echoing in modern inquiries into government overreach and media complicity, as digital feeds scroll endlessly with news of scandals in the dead of night. When city lights blur into a haze of half-truths, Webb's legacy endures as a beacon for those willing to chase the shadows. His complex legacy, marked by triumphs and tragedies, invites us to reflect on the costs of exposing uncomfortable realities, the isolation, the doubt, the ultimate silence. In a world where official narratives often cloak inconvenient facts, Webb's fate serves as both warning and inspiration. The air in those forgotten archives, dusty and laden with the weight of untold stories, whispers of the ongoing battle for truth. It compels us to ask, who else has been dismantled and isolated for daring to question? And what truths remain buried as a result? As we close this chapter, let's linger on that meditative edge, pondering the delicate balance between accountability and the forces that seek to silence it. Gary Webb paid dearly for his pursuit, but in his story, we find the enduring call to shine light into the darkness, no matter the personal toll. For in the end, it's the only way to honor the truths that refuse to stay hidden.